Welcome everyone to the Nerd Summit 2020. I wanted to thank the Nerd Summit organizers for inviting us. We're really excited to be here and present to you. And in particular, we're excited about how significant this year it is to do a virtual conference. The truth is that we know we're supposed to be keeping social distance, right? And we're supposed to be far away for our benefit because of COVID and because of all of the things that are happening globally. And yet, here we are at a tech conference, having tech, in essence, save the world. This wouldn't be possible unless we had folks like us who are interested in technology and putting special ingredients together to make something unique happen. So this year is significant and we're grateful. So let's introduce ourselves. I'm Dr. Esmilda Abreu. I'm the AVP for Student Life and Dean of Students at Manhattan College. I also consider myself a bit of a social innovator.
And I'm Kirsten Richert. That's Kirsten like ear, which I always say. And I am adjunct professor at Montclair State University, and I take the label of change catalyst.
Okay, so we are really interested in sharing a little bit about who we are first before moving on to our topic, because it really is a combination of who we are together. So we came together as friends in the 6th grade. We were in science class together. Kirsten was new to our school and she was from all around the country at different times. And I was new to what they call the one class. So I was part of New York City's tracking system. And it was the first time that my sort of tracking was put as possible for the gifted and talented group, right? The one class. And that was important for me as an immigrant. English is not my first language. And so there was a real educational trajectory to allowing myself to see myself as one of those people. So we'll talk a little bit about diversity in STEM, but then Kiri and I really got together under science. And because of that, we went ahead and started winning first prize in our science fair contest at school.
Growing plants. Actually, our first experiment in 6th grade was growing plants and seeing the difference of light versus no light.
Onion plants, very sexy. So anyway, so we did onion plants, we got first prize, and then we went on to continue to do solar distillators and all kinds of psychology projects and won, second prize and first prize and city contests and so forth. And we started creating this identity of us as scientists. And we went to Bronx Science and went on to looking at marine biology things, and later went out into different fields, but continued to have that STEM story. And we continued to work together collaboratively to look at the world through different lenses, diverse lenses, unique lenses, but come to some sort of innovation strategy. And so we're really going to try to encourage you guys to see yourselves as people that can do that collaboration, regardless of where you're coming from in your field or in your identity.
So we wanted to start off with just a taste of innovation. And it might be a little bit of a tease, but I have something that many of us are very commonly familiar with, right? A packet of M&Ms. And here's the thing. We're going to imagine that we are actually people who belong to the company that owns M&Ms. And you guys are my dream team out there. And I have called you all in because there's a massive crisis that our plant had a malfunction in the factory. And we have cases and cases and warehouses full of ruined M&Ms. And I've called you all together because we don't want to take this as a loss. We want to look at what can we do. So our scenario is the assembly line failed to perforate the bags and they became extremely hard to open.
Okay.
So just imagine, all right, what would it be like if you had this delicious packet of M&Ms, but it was extremely hard to open? who would actually want this thing, right? So in the chat, who could you sell these M&Ms that are hard to open to, and what would the benefit be? What would be their actually selling feature? So I can see there's some cool ideas coming in. We got
bodybuilders.
We got Edward Scissorhands wants it. Hey, these are child-proof M&Ms, right? You can give the kid the M&M at the beginning of the journey and say, if you don't kill your brother on the way to grandma's house, I will cut these open and then you can eat them. Oh, I see manufacturers of scissors, right?
Very great.
It's a co-packaging thing,
Bundle.
right? you got. Oh, what about parents of young kids who actually want some candy left at the end of?
This is the parent package. It's the one that we keep. I like it.
All right, Van Halen concert promoters.
I love it.
Okay, so that was an example, very, very quickly, of how you guys activated your intelligence. And in this case, there were so many different kinds of suggestions here, right? And when I run these sessions, it's amazing what kind of cool ideas people can come up with for this one. Sometimes they say it's a beanbag, right?
Or for backpacking.
Right, exactly. Outdoors people. Yeah, you want to make sure this is not gonna come apart when it gets bumped around in your backpack, but still be delicious on the trip, right? So that is just a taste for how quickly just posing that question, what could the benefit of this be, totally changes our approach to something. And we're going to kind of keep that in mind as we continue to think together about this topic. So just a quick sense, our game plan, that was our welcome and introduction. We're going to explain the core elements of an inclusive culture, and then we're going to look at how that really connects with innovation principles. Then we're going to focus on some key technology diversity challenges in your workplaces. We're going to share a couple of models for proactive change, and then we're going to invite you all to think about how this applies to you and your work. So that's our game plan.
Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit about diversity, and know that what we're going to share with you are some key diversity concepts about inclusion and about starting your exploration. In essence, when we think about diversity, we're thinking about a mosaic of unique individuals from a variety of racial, ethnic, sexuality, religious, gender orientation, gender identity, culture, geographical even, age, abilities and disabilities, and also looking at your intellectual, creative, and artistic gifts, and how do they come together for a richness of difference. So diversity has a few key advantages, and we like to leverage it in business. We want to be able to understand our customers, right? We want to be able to see new opportunities. We want to retain talent. We want to improve quality. We want to spark innovation, which is what we're definitely going to be talking about. And we want to create a wider pool of people that we can, get this talent from. We also want to avoid legal problems, right? We definitely don't want those costs. And we want to increase productivity because the science shows that that is linked to diversity. We want to gain market share, and we want to be responsive to the environment and the changes in communities and populations. And also, once we have them, we want to motivate them to grow, right? So it's interesting because all of those key advantages are supported by the literature. And one of the ones that I really like to hone in on is a 2015 study by Leighton and Prince. It was in Diversity Matters. And it found that companies that had the top quartile of racial and ethnic diversity were 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So really high levels of financial benefit. The top quartile for gender diversity brought about 15% higher financial returns in contrast to the national industry medians. And then what was also interesting was that if we looked at the bottom quadrangle, in other words, the quartile at the end, we found that for race, ethnicity, and gender, statistically, it was less likely to be even in the above average financial returns compared to other companies in the data set. So when you didn't have it, there was a real loss there too. And in the United States in particular, we've noticed throughout our research trends that there is a linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance. So better financial performance, you saw racial and ethnic diversity increases. For every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity in senior executive team, so in other words, in your high level, for every 10%, the earnings before interest and taxes raise 0.8%. So that's a pretty big, significant turnaround. So what does this all diversity mean? And, you know, is it all about race and ethnicity? Well, it's not, right? So what I want you to think about is your whole self. And we're going to do what I normally call a step exercise. Usually we're in a circle, and I'll say something that if applies to you at the time, you would step into the circle. Today, because we're virtual, I'm just going to have you lift your finger up on your lap so that you know that you've stepped in. So step into the circle if you were raised inside the United States. If you were raised inside the United States. Step into the circle if you were raised outside of the United States. Okay. Step into the circle if you come from a family where English is not your first language. All right. Raise your finger if you know someone with a mental illness. Raise your finger if you've ever volunteered for a cause. Raise your finger if you are a musician. Now keep your finger up if you're any good. No, just teasing. I'm just teasing. Raise your finger if you've ever participated in some sort of athletic endeavor or sport in your life. Great, put your finger down. If you were raised in or currently practice some sort of faith or spirituality. Very good. Raise your finger if you have ever worn a beanie hat. Propeller beanie hat, anyone? Yeah. Raise your finger if you were raised Christian. Very good. Raise your finger if you were raised or practice Jewish faith or tradition. Raise your finger if you were raised in or currently practice Muslim faith or religion. Good. Raise your finger if you were raised in or currently practice Baha'i faith or religion. Good. Raise your finger if you were raised in or currently practice Hindu faith or religion. Very good. Raise your finger if you consider yourself agnostic or atheist. Good. Raise your finger if you consider yourself African American. Raise your finger if you identify with being European. Raise your finger if you identify as Black. Very good. Raise your finger if you identify as being white. Raise your finger if you have Asian heritage or background. And finally, raise your finger if you're Latino heritage or background. Okay, very good. Raise your finger if you are a military status or veteran status. Raise your finger if you have ever been called a name because of your skin tone or ethnicity. Raise your finger if you have ever been called a name because you were not acting like you were supposed to based on society's expectations. Okay. Raise your finger if you have a disability other than glasses. Very good. Raise your finger if you consider yourself a nerd. Raise your finger if you have traveled outside of the United States. Okay. You might want to think about all the countries that you've been to. Raise your finger if you have a unique physical attribute: tall, short, funky hair, curvy. Okay. Raise your finger if you've ever been LARPing. Raise your finger if you've ever dated someone of a different race or ethnicity as yourself. And raise your finger if you've known someone or know someone from the LGBTQ community. Raise your finger if you have children. Raise your finger if you are responsible for another human being. Raise your finger if you have dietary restriction or are a vegetarian. Very good. And finally, raise your finger if you speak more than one language. Keep your finger up. Is 2 or more? 3 or more? 4 or more? 5 or more? Chat if you have more than 5 languages. I would love to know. All right. And finally, raise your finger if you are first generation college student. Now, let me know if there was a particular thing or area that you wished I had asked about that I didn't get a chance to. So you can chat about that. I wanted to bring apart this exercise, and the reason that I take the time to do so is because diversity is often thought of as very clear set categories. But the truth is that diversity is not just those elements that you are born with. In other words, it's not just inherent characteristics like race, ethnicity, height, and those sorts of things. We actually also acquire our identities and part of what makes us diverse, right? The beanie hats, the LARPing, the travel, the languages, all of the things that we learn and that we acquire as we live our lives and have experiences are really, really important. And finally, there's the element of bringing all of those inherent and acquired experiences and aspects of who you are together and noticing how they intersect. With this, we want to take a look at all the dimensions of diversity and all of the dimensions that make us who we are. We tend to have those kind of inherent ones like age or sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, gender, physical qualities like really crazy curly hair or height, right? And then we have dimensions that are a little bit more broad, like our education or our parental status, maybe geography, or even our neurodiversity. How do we think? What's our style? Are we introverts or extroverts? Our personality comes into play, right? What made us uniquely special for our job? What gives us a particular way of handling a problem? What is our political ideology? And does appearance matter when it comes to diversity? We want to think about all of those elements and throw a very, very wide net, because the truth is that when it comes to diversity, there is the sort of primary pieces of who we are, and there's the secondary pieces, but then there's the organizational pieces too, like the parts that we are when we're in our professional lives, and then finally culture in general. And there's many, many, many subcultures in your life. So when you think about diversity, think about your primary cultures, and then think of those little tiny subcultures that make you who you are. Are you part of a gaming group? Are you part of a kayaking group? Are you part of a history aficionado? Do you love, something particularly? And then when you take all of those parts of who you are and bring them all together, you'll notice here, very much in the very, very center, is a little inkling of who you are. So in my case, for example, I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman, I'm bilingual, I'm a homeowner, I'm a parent, right? And I come from this incredibly mixed racial and religious family. So we always tease at Thanksgiving to stay away from the kosher empanadas unless you're keeping kosher, because we're all Dominican. So we love our empanadas, but if you're not keeping kosher, you got to stay away from those. They always taste better somehow. And so I always like to share that, you know, it makes you uniquely you. And then you take that uniqueness and you try to find it, because there's something aspirational about diversity. There's a part of us that think that diversity is something we wait for, right? That we have to not look at it until we've achieved the right numbers. And this Deloitte 2014 study basically showed us that about 71% of organizations that aspire to have an inclusive culture feel that they weren't able to achieve it. In fact, within 3 years of analyzing their aspiration to what they actually were able to achieve in terms of inclusion, only 11% of the companies felt that they had that they had an environment in which employees feel involved, respected, valued, and connected. Only 11%. And so here's what we think. We think you don't wait to have diversity. You don't wait to get the numbers. It's good to aspire, but you've got to go beyond it to a premise where you apply an innovation structure and create inclusive practices such that you can align innovation to inclusion and foster some sort of structure where belonging and activating diversity becomes something you push into. And you can't do it right away, but in the pushing and in the commitment, you begin to get closer to where you want to go. And so we want to definitely push into innovation, knowing that inclusion, diversity, and belonging are behind it. So what is an inclusive culture? An inclusive culture is one in which diverse backgrounds of individuals are leveraged. It's diverse backgrounds of individuals that are leveraged to drive a value. It's a diverse backgrounds of individuals that are leveraged to drive value and business results by creating an environment in which employees feel involved, respected, valued, and connected. So if you notice, this is a very active definition. We leverage and drive because we want results. And so finally, I want to say that when it comes to diversity and innovation and aspiration, it is a happening, it is active. I like to look at cultural competency as something that is never ending. It's a process of learning, and it's an endless process of learning that leads to an ability, right? A superpower. Process of learning that leads to an ability to effectively respond to challenges and opportunities posed by the presence of diversity in a defined social system. It is contained, and we're constantly and intentionally creating environments where we can learn. And because of that, you cannot have cultural competency. In fact, I've dedicated more than 30 years to learning a lot about lots and lots of different cultures and lots of different religions. And I can't know everything there is to know about Baha'i cultures. I know how to maybe conduct myself at a wedding, but other than that, I can't say I know all the intricacies and all the holidays, but I want to know, I'm curious, right? And so cultural competency is important, but along with the cultural competency, we want cultural humility. You want to be able to hold yourself in a state of curiosity about people and humility so that you can ask, hey, Kirsten, what is it that Mennonites do when it comes to this or that? I don't know much about Mennonites and I'm curious. And then when the person approaches you with humility, wanting to know more, because it's impossible to know everything, right? My job then is to be socially and culturally gracious, to have compassion and allow for them to grapple and be curious and ask, and then I step back and allow for that to have the conversation or initiate the conversation. So then my ability to be gracious allows them to continue to engage. Finally, we want to take that gracious stance and we want to look at it through the lens of inclusive culture. So we want to look at integrative leadership, cross-functional and level bonds. We want to think about problem solving not on our own, but collaboratively. And we want participatory decision making to guide us through so that we can reach that aspirational piece that only 11% of companies, according to Deloitte, think that they've achieved.
Yeah, so when we think about these core elements of inclusive culture, what you'll see that integrative leadership, cross-functional and level bonds, collaborative problem solving, participatory decision making, how do you do that, right? So our premise is one way that's so helpful to do that is actually to think about doing intentional innovation. And innovation practices can foster the development of new relationships and establish trust, right? They suspend barriers and assumptions. They actually encourage active listening and respect from different perspectives. They leverage diverse strengths, and they really help create a sense of community. So let's kind of take a look at that. When I work with teams in my job as a consultant to organizations, nonprofit and profit both, that are working to innovate with their teams, I help them by teaching them some core innovation principles. And those core principles, one of the ones that I always start with is this idea of diversity of representation. Because when you go to solve a problem, when you go to invent something new, invariably, whoever is deciding, hey, we've got to invent this new thing, only thinks to invite the folks that are their top of mind folks. A lot of times it's the people that are their direct reports or the folks that they already work with on a regular basis, right? So one of the very first questions that we talk about is this idea of diversity of representation. So, okay, and who else might we invite to understand? So who else are the stakeholders up the food chain that you'll need to sell this idea to later, right? Who else are the people who are actually going to be executing this idea? What other departments might be involved in actually carrying this thing out and that we might need to get their input and their feedback? And then that's sort of the center, that I, right? Who in the organization needs to be involved in this, right? And then you can also look a little bit further out. Who needs to be aligned with this? Whose input do we need to get? Maybe we're inviting some key vendors. So if you're thinking about diversity of representation and you're noticing that that inner circle is not diverse in some key ways that you know you need to be, who else might you invite that represents the clients you serve, or represents the vendors you partner with, or represents the key institutions that are supporting or giving input to your customers, right? And that's that sort of middle circle, right? And then when you're looking at all the way broadly, you're thinking, okay, so who are the thought leaders that we need to bring to the table here? Who are the folks who understand social trends, that understand best practices in this industry? And how can we bring them in? And sometimes that's just literally tapping someone on your team to kind of represent those thought leaders in the conversation, right? But sometimes you can actually invite those people, and that fills out the diversity of representation and allows for that diversity of opinions, more input, right? Just even at the start of the process. So another key thing that I talk with teams about is this idea of breaking fixedness. And when you think about human beings, that exercise, that step in exercise illustrated so brilliantly, we tend to think of ourselves and think of other folks as sort of these static things, right? If I told you, you know, what does a house look like, right? Maybe you would draw me a house that looks very similar to that thing on top, right? And then if I sort of asked you to switch modes a little bit and kind of put you in Minecraft mode and said, okay, what are the components of that house? What are the elements of that house that we might take advantage of if we stopped thinking of it in blocks. And here's the thing, the human brain needs to think of things as wholes, right? We can't be micro-analyzing every little thing. A chair needs to look like a chair, needs to look like a chair, right? But when you're inventing something new, deliberately suspending your assumptions about what you know are critical, and sort of looking at the elements that don't normally come to the fore, right? What are the component parts? Hugely useful in innovation, and actually really, really useful in diversity thinking too, right? What are the elements? How can we look at things freshly without that grid of assumptions that's filtering out all the knowledge that we normally could get from a diverse group, right? And then I talk about patterns and connections, right? A lot of times, like remember that example when we were thinking about the M&Ms, right? We think of the M&Ms as a whole, right? But now, if we sort of suspend that knowing, what new connections, what new patterns can we apply? What strange things can we put together? Edward Scissorhands plus M&Ms packet, right? You know, what new connections that you make. And whenever I do this with teams, I always say, if it feels awkward, you're onto something, right? If you have that sort of momentary, but this just doesn't make sense, that's not the way we do things here, perfect, you are on track, right? So that idea of coming up with patterns.
It's true, because when someone says something ridiculous and everybody starts laughing, you have to take a pause because you might be onto something there.
Right, right. So it's changing the ability to listen and watch for those connections, right? And then another thing I share is this idea of, this comes out of the discipline of design thinking, right? And what it says is, for those of you who are aware of the design thinking diamond, right? You start with the problem, then you diverge in your thinking. And then at some point when you feel like you've got a really good representation, you converge in your thinking and decide what to do next, right? So it's very important in a setting where you're making decisions as an organization to have this sense of timing. Is this a time where we need to diverge and get input from many, many different perspectives, right? And how can we do that in an efficient way so that we actually don't solve the wrong problem, right? Let's understand, get all these perspectives on the problem, and then we can converge on the actual problem we need to solve, right? If we know what the problem is that we need to solve, what are all the various possible ways that we can come up with to solve them? And then given our mission, our values, what we're trying to pull off, what's feasible, right? How can we kind of come together and get a sense, a consensus, a shared understanding about what to push through next, right? And then there's this idea of experimentation. Like, we don't actually know how to do this. A lot of times people approach new thinking and it's like, there's one way. It's the right way to do it. It's the wrong way. We'll do the right way, right? This sense of, hey, we're going to be experimenting changes people's focus. You might be trying multiple things at once, right? You might be trying something in a little way, right? And it's that suspension of knowing and actually, hey, I'm gonna look at the results, right? I'm gonna look to see how this is effective or not effective, right? And then this idea of iteration to progress, right? So design thinking says, hey, you're trying to make a change, you're aspiring to diversity, you're aspiring to innovate, right? Don't just try to do everything all at once. Don't build out this whole big thing, right? Try that little something in the experiment, see what works, try something else, build on it, build on what works, and take away what is keeping you back and keep going and keep stepping, this idea of a journey.
And don't right and wrong it, right? So this idea, again, of cultural competence and cultural humility, right? You're curious, you're not judging, you're not stuck, you're suspending judgment, you're suspending ideas. You're up here, loose and ready to find possibly a new way of interacting, a new way of knowing. This curiosity is important, and the sense of play, right? You cannot get it wrong if you're experimenting. There is no failure in experimentation, and that's where this iterative piece comes into play.
Totally. So that was sort of a quick overview of how diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of aligns with innovation. So when you're cultivating that inclusive culture, the diversity and inclusion approach requires the creation of an organization with diverse people in it, right? Innovation practices foster building a team with diversity as a prime selection principle, right? That decision-making team, that project team, that team that's pushing something forward, that's a prime principle. It requires, diversity and inclusion require acknowledging assumptions. Everybody's got assumptions. And acknowledging that there is unconscious bias that's filtering out possibilities, right? And innovation practices foster a deliberate break to that fixedness that's going to interrupt those patterns of mind. Diversity and inclusion require that different voices be heard, respected, and valued. And innovation practices actually has effective ways to get input from a bunch of thinkers. And then diversity and inclusion require actually leveraging those different perspectives to actually do something to improve organizational practices to get closer to that mission, right? And so when you do innovation, you're already knowing you have the organization success in mind, and what you're doing is ensuring collaboration so that your problem and your solutions for those are actually tied to that organizational success. So that's kind of a really nice map between the two. So,
and you can see how they crisscross, right? So when you focus on key tech diversity challenges, what you're really doing is looking at innovation challenges and diversity challenges almost together, right? And asking yourself, how might you approach creating diversity and innovation in a strategic way? So we really want visioning to be part of it. I wanted to say that there is real value in pushing back and looking at it from a wide lens and approaching this in a strategic manner. There's the value of diversity. First, you have to commit to it. You're curious about it. You want it in the workplace. You want the benefits that it brings. But then go ahead and take a real look at what you have to play with. You know, what's your culture like? Think about mutual respect in the organization. How do you actually navigate that? What's your sense of belonging? And when were those moments where you just didn't quite belong? And what about equality principles or equity principles? What's the hiring situation? What's the pay and income situation? How do you actually celebrate the various different backgrounds that people bring? So the culture is important. And then what about opportunity? Do you actually, hire people because you want to give them an opportunity? Do you mentor people because you want to give them an opportunity? And have you given those plum jobs to people that you want to support to grow? What's their access to top management positions? Can I go and talk to somebody about how they did it? And then, when it comes to development, where do I get new skill sets that I really am curious about and want to know? And then leadership's important too, because when it comes to certain things, sometimes we are either limited in the organization as far as leadership, but sometimes we limit ourselves too. So self-understanding and self-awareness are really key. I happen to know a lot of people that will not do public speaking because they have an accent, right? And I always remind them, that never stopped Einstein. He had a crazy accent and he was there lecturing in Princeton and people leaned in, right? So we want to support leadership and leadership development in all areas of our organization when we say we want diversity. So we looked at windows. What are these opportunity windows that allow for diversity? Well, the first one is hiring. We want to be able to come up with different kinds of things that allow for hiring. Then we want to think about structures that might allow for, showcasing hiring structures, retaining them afterwards, activating the diversity that we have. And then once we have it, how do you advance folk so that there's always a pipeline?
one of the ways in which we decided to approach talking about this today was giving you a little showcase or a little snippet of things that we've done in different organizations that work. One of the ones that was fairly simple to duplicate, and I would say that anyone can do, is we created common language at Pratt Institute. They found that they had engineers, architects, designers, folks in fashion that wanted to work together. And so those students were being sent off to NASA to build space stations and interactable tech wearables, all kinds of really neat things, but they weren't speaking the same language. Mm-hmm. And when it came to trying to bring in diversity towards the mosaic of people that they had, they were having a hard time. So we created a diversity advocate training, and this was a shared training. It had several different modules. And when people became diversity advocates, there was literally a graduation, a certificate, and a pin. And what was wonderful about these folks was that they now had a common understanding, common definitions, common scenario play. They worked on different scenarios and challenges. And then now those diversity advocates are being brought into the HR process, and they're called diversity hire. And now each time that there is a hiring committee, we have 1 or 2 diversity advocates. We wound up training about 150 folks over there at Pratt. And what's terrific is now the same people are not constantly being tapped to be on those search committees in order to bring in diversity, because we have 150 people that value it, have common language and understanding about what the organization actually wanted to achieve when it came to talent and hiring. Another showcase that I really loved was for retention. And here we were struggling with gender identity and gender expression in the organization. And so we got a bunch of folks that dealt with our data. And so this was IT, it was our library, our librarians, it was our financial aid officers, it was our housing representatives, folks that used housing software, anybody who had to deal with data and data sets. So everybody from folks in the ID office all the way to finance and administration needed to be part of this data standards committee. And what the data standards committee was then charged to do was think about gender identity and gender expression when it came to our faculty, staff, and students. And what they were able to do was find all of the different lists in which we needed legal representation, in other words, our legal names, and then areas where that was not a constraint in any way, and people could actually use their preferred or chosen name. And we were able to come together and bring in a huge amount of data sets such that we could honor how we were going to represent our students and our staff and faculty. And so you would be able to have your preferred name in the front of your ID, you had your ID number in the back, and sometimes if you had a legal name that you wanted to have on your ID, we would have it on the back. But then all of these things also transferred into the way that we did prefixes in our larger data sets for going to and platforms in order for mailings to happen. We made sure that we used Colleague. So we made sure that Colleague was able to pull out preferred names, etc., on rosters for schools. And it was the genius of bringing all of those people together for one common goal that this made this a retention success.
So another thing, another model that we wanted to share was this idea of running an innovation lab. So sometimes in the life cycle of an organization and in your work, there is a moment where you know you need to invent something new. And that is a fabulous time to be able to activate the talents of your organization. So this particular organization, for example, helps K-12 education, and they had a problem they needed to solve. They had a product that they had been using for many years, and they wanted to reinvent it as a digital product going forward. Perfect, actually, timing for today, right? And it was what I talked about before. They sort of invited the folks they normally think of inviting to invent the next generation. And Esmilda and I encourage them to think more broadly, right? So what does that actually allow? When you have an innovation lab where you're bringing people representing all levels of the organization, deliberately representing that kind of diversity, and you're having them all focus on something really critical that needs to be solved, and you're deliberately using facilitation techniques that get everybody on the same page, that actually actively get input very, very quickly, and actually then sort through that input, get a common sense, and then leave that innovation lab with a charge. It makes the folks at all levels of the organization feel heard and feel valued, and actually get really excited about the next generation thing. And I know this picture is kind of funny right now because you can see everybody sitting at the table and not being socially distant, right? But I want to say that Esmilda and I are actually running a virtual innovation. Actually, it's a think tank, right? Very soon thereafter. So the physicalness of this is one thing, but actually this idea of all focusing on a common problem at once and deliberately getting lots and lots of input from different people to a core objective the organization is working to solve is a really effective tool.
I remember one woman saying, I was never asked and I was never invited. And for her, her sense of belonging started then when she was able to be asked to come and participate and invited to be at the table. These things make a huge difference.
Yeah, and actually a manager came up to me afterwards and said, wow, you know, this woman that had been on his team that he'd had interactions with for 2 years already, he said she had amazing things to say. In our small breakout groups, she was creating these sketches that really moved our conversation forward. I was totally blown away. She never says a word in any meeting we've ever had before, right? And now his listening for her, he said, oh, and I'm gonna put her on this next project, right? So like that idea of deliberately creating this cross-pollination, it changes people's ability to access, and it changes managers and leaders' ability to understand who they have and what talents they have.
Yeah, collective genius, right? And then advancing. Advancing is the other window, you know, when it comes to diversity opportunities. This is my A team. It's my assessment, research, and evaluation team. Different levels of originally of understanding of how to do research, how to do surveys, how to do analysis, right? Even things like going through approvals in IRB, all of those things were relatively new to them. They came from very different departments in the division. And so we made sure that no matter where they were, if they were interested in being part of the A team, they got to be part of the A team. And we trained them up one another. We created a structure so that every new A team member had the benefit of going into, you know, our shared Google Drive and noticing what tools people had used to do their jobs. They helped each other. We did case analysis. The other thing is we had a shared, you know, calendar where we knew who was going to do research when, so that we didn't like stumble all over each other. We obviously had a shared identity and we had a ton of fun. And so what this group did was they innovated for the entire division, regardless of what their individual department wanted. And they had this real sense of identity of being the A team, so that I could say, hey, Kirsten, listen, I'm really struggling with this particular setup here. What did you do last year on this, you know, assessment, or on this, even something as simple as a survey? Sometimes these things became a hindrance for people. And then the nice thing about it is that once the A team was together, they could share and showcase their work. And so all of a sudden,
they became visible in the organization. And a lot of them actually went on to get tremendous promotion. I'm not there anymore. I'm in a new organization, and I miss them tons. So,
oh, and you said there's a mentorship component to
there
it too,
is a
right?
definite mentorship component. Now folks that are senior A-team folks are really training up junior A-team folks, and they have internal their own website where they're doing their own mentoring and training, and that's been huge for mentoring, but also for sponsorship.
Great. So this is the moment where we say, what ideas does this generate for you all in your work? So in the chat, we would love if you answered the question, what idea do these examples spark when you think about your own work? So go ahead and chat some thoughts in.
I almost wish I had beanies for all of you.
Yeah, I was actually, so.
There we are.
Let's see, from Cheryl, it says,
I spotted another beanie, that's right.
STEM groups from home, the hiring model, but also the staff for looking at participants, watching more closely how people interact. Definitely the piece about thinking about people with different language abilities.
Google Classroom.
Awesome. Google Classroom, the A-team sounds like a slice of heaven that goes beyond the diversity issue. It certainly broadens it,
one
right?
and the same, honestly. A lot of these folks, you know, because remember, diversity is not just identity, you know, physical inherent features. It's our introverts too, and our extroverts, and the folks that are new and junior in the organization as opposed to senior. We really want to make sure that when we slice into diversity, we're slicing at all the categories so that we can really get things done. So A-Team is easy to create. It's got a real structure to it. And the principle underneath it is creativity and innovation. And then the glue is participation. Who's participating? Who's allowed to come to the table? Who's invited? That's really important.
Yeah, and how does that activate their belonging when they're finally invited, right?
That's exactly
you know,
right.
That if the ultimate is sort of creating that culture of belonging, like that's a great way to do it. So when we think about this, we really want to say, okay, so we talked about these key windows, so hiring, retaining, activating, and advancing. And we kind of want to go back to Esmilda's definition of this idea of a process, right? This is not a one and done. Diversity isn't a workshop you go to and then need to re-engage with your real work or your normal work, right? This is actually something, I love this image because it represents this idea of spiraling, right? How are we raising the bar? How are we, through this continuous process of learning, through trying things out in hiring, through trying things out in advancing, retaining, activating, in all of these places, how are we, and all of us have different levels of ability to influence, right? You might be working one-on-one like me. I am often a consultant who's working by myself during the day, right? How can I, activate all the wisdom that's around me, right? And a lot of us are inside of organizations. We're managers or we report to folks in organizations. How can we take this idea of marrying diversity and innovation together and watch what happens?
Yeah, and it's not about we have it or we don't have it. Oh, we're not diverse. We are diverse. We are inclusive. We're not inclusive. It's about committing to a value and leveraging what you have and then being able to push into it. So it's good to aspire, but it's really great to act into. Act into can be at any point of having, right? You can always improve. If you think about it as a garden, you put in some seeds, some sprout, some come out, some bloom, some don't. You just keep working the garden until it looks like what you hope that it would look like, and it acts like what it should act like, right?
Right. So we are asking you now to commit to one action. So of all of the things, all of the possibilities that occurred to you over the course of us sharing with you these concepts, what is one action that you can take in the next 90 days, given everything going on right now, right? What's one action that you can take to commit to doing things differently, to marrying these principles in the work that you do?
Maybe there's someone in tech that, or not in tech, that you think ought to be in tech and that you might want to invite. Maybe you want to put M&Ms in people's, mailboxes and, give them the challenge we gave you. And if they answer something interesting, tell them, wow, you're innovative, be part of a team, join our meeting, come and visit. Sometimes it's just the invitation.
Yeah. So now, as we're kind of drawing to a close, one of the things that Esmilda and I always build in to innovation work that we do with teams is these moments to pause and actually kind of pull up and look at that bigger picture that she shared with you and to reflect. So as we are closing, we know sometimes you sort of take that moment to breathe and then you ask a good question and see what emerges, right? So as we are breathing and taking that moment to reflect on everything we just shared with you, ask yourself the question, what's one insight that I'm leaving with now? And if you could just go ahead and add it to the chat now. What's one insight? Awesome.
These are great. I love the developing synapses for diversity and innovation. It's fabulous, right?
Yeah, so much of what we think about a lot is kind of growing that mental muscle, right? Very cool. So we want to thank you all. Go ahead and keep adding your reflections because we are saving this delightful chat, right? But we just really wanted to take a moment to thank you because we know how intense this time is, and we really wanted to acknowledge the amazing commitment you have to learn at this moment.
And I want to say that there's something that happens in the human brain that lights up completely different when we're in a state of gratitude. And my sense is that by you continuing to think about innovation, collective genius, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and even your own identity, you're going to be able to really find yourself appreciating yourself more and others and your organization and workplace. And so because I know you'll be doing some of that, I know I'll be doing some of that, and I'm very, very grateful.
So we just wanted you to know that we would love to hear how this is bubbling out in your daily practices. As you go, please don't hesitate to reach out to the two of us and kind of let us know, how did this ripple spread? How did this impact you? What are you seeing? What do you need help with? What do you have questions about? So please reach out. Kelly pasted in a little handout that has our contact information in there. So we just really wanted to say, turn it upside down, folks, right? Look at it differently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have to unmute.
Yeah. Cool.